In this lesson on equations and inequalities, we are going to have a look at quadratic equations that you can solve by adding a square root on both sides. In example 1, we have a quadratic equation. So I'm going to start off by solving it like we did in lesson 1. In lesson 1 we said when it's a quadratic equation, we take all the terms to one side equal to 0 so that we can factorize. And in this case, the factorization is difference between squares. So then we will get that x can be 2 or x can be minus 2. Now, when you have a quadratic equation with only two terms, there's a second option. We can keep each term on its own side and then simply go and draw a square root on both sides. But now we need to keep in mind that for a quadratic equation, we usually need two possible answers. So we need to say that it's the positive and the negative value of this square root. So when we now take the square root on the left, we are left with x. And on the right, the square root of 4 can be plus or minus 2, which gives us the same answer as we had with the first method. So when you have a quadratic equation with only two terms, you have a second option. That second option is to get each term on its own side of the equation and then add a square root on both sides. You just need to keep in mind that you then have plus or minus the square root answer. If we now have a look at example 2, we once again have a quadratic equation with two terms. So our first option would be to factorize using difference between squares. Because 10 is not a perfect square number, this shows us that it will have irrational answers. So instead of factorizing, let's have a look at our second option. We are going to keep the x squared on the left and get it on its own there by adding the 10 on the right. Now I'm going to take the square root on both sides of the equation and remember to add the plus or minus on the right. And then you will have x is plus or minus the square root of 10, which when calculated and rounded will be plus or minus 3,16. So like I've mentioned, irrational answers. And we can also ask you leave your answer in surd form, and in that case you would have stopped at plus or minus the square root of 10. In example 3, there's just one little change, and that is that there's a 3 multiplied to x squared. If you don't think about it and just jump right into it, you might say, let's take the square root on both sides. The problem with that will be that you will now be stuck with a square root of 3 times x on the left. So rather than doing that, always start by getting the variable that is squared alone on one side, and we will do this by dividing by 3 on the other side to get 17. And if I now take the square root on both sides, I will have x is equal to the positive or negative value of root 17. Which if I go and calculate and round will be plus or minus 4,12. Even though example 4 looks a bit different, the basic principles stay the same. We have a quadratic equation and it consists of two terms. So even though I have the choice to multiply out that bracket squared, add up all the like terms and factorize, I have a second option, and that is to get the term with the square alone on one side, and I will do that by taking the 4 to the other side. Now to get rid of the square, I'm going to add a square root on both sides, and then of course I'm going to remember that I have two options in the answer on the right. So on the left I'm left only with x minus a half, and on the right I have plus or minus 2. To get my two final answers, I'm now going to split this up into two equations, saying x minus a half can be the positive 2, or x minus a half can be equal to negative 2. So then I have x is equal to 2 plus a half, which is 2.5, or x is equal to minus 2 plus a half, which is minus 1 and a half.